we've made it to module 10, and this week we're moving on to the 1990s. This is actually when I spent most of my time working professionally as a camera assistant and cinematographer through the 90s and then into the early 2000s. I actually went to film school in the very early 90s as well. So Robert Rodriguez, who directed the film we're watching this week, was a big influence on me in my career and me wanting to get into the film industry. So here's our film. Here it is, El Mariachi, by Robert Rodriguez. It's a 1992 Spanish language film. I believe on the syllabus it says it's a Mexican film. It's actually a Mexican-American film. It was filmed partially in Mexico, partially in Texas, both on border towns on each side of the border. Robert Rodriguez is an American filmmaker of Mexican heritage. The film was actually made by him and his buddy, who's the lead actor in the film. They met in film school. And the idea was that they wanted to make a film that could get distributed in straight video release. This is back in the day when people would rent VHS and DVDs and things like that. And they thought it could be a straight-to-video rental in the Mexican market. And so they made this Spanish language film. And the idea was to make this movie, make enough money to make their next movie, and just try to get bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? So again, filmed partially in Mexico, partially in Texas. This is an independent neo-Western. Like, that's the genre that it would fit into, okay? So an indie film is any film that is not attached or associated or produced by kind of the traditional Hollywood studio system. So when they went out to make this film, there was no studio behind it that was financing it. This was just some people who got together and decided to make a movie, right? And back in the 90s, this was a huge boom being in the indie film industry, right? A lot of the films that I worked on were indie film movies, and how you would figure out how to sell them and get distribution and make money from them is that you would take them to big film festivals, and hopefully a studio would then buy it and distribute it for you. And that's how you would make money on a lot of those. There were studio films as well, right? The traditional studio system was still there and thriving, but there were these group of new filmmakers who wanted to tell stories that weren't necessarily fitting into the Hollywood mold. Very similar to like the late 60s and early 70s in Hollywood as well. It's just kind of coming around again. And so you were getting films by Robert Rodriguez. Quentin Tarantino was another big person in this whole world at the time. He came out with Reservoir Dogs in 1992 as well. And then also Spike Lee was producing some content early on that necessarily wasn't big studio stuff. It was kind of independent kind of stuff as well. So that's what the whole indie world was all about, just trying to find a way to get your stories out, which was a little bit more difficult back then because all you could do was shoot on film back then. There were no digital cameras. Nowadays you can shoot a movie on your phone. In fact, I've shot a couple films on an iPhone. You can shoot it with it, but back then you had to shoot on film, which was a pretty expensive process usually, okay? So neo-Western, what's a neo-Western? A neo-Western, it reflects the traditions of the Western film genre, right? But it's set in more of a contemporary urban setting. And they kind of changed kind of some of the roles a little bit. And so we'll talk a little bit about the more traditions or the traditional kind of story plot lines that you see in traditional Westerns when we get to narrative. The other thing that's very important about this film, which is one of the reasons why I selected for us to watch this film, is that the budget was $7,200, which is next to nothing to make a movie, okay? $7,200, and about $6,600 of it was spent on film and film processing, right? So they spent very little money in the making of the movie. And then this film got picked up and made $2.6 million in the box office. So again, that's not a huge box office return based on like today's numbers, but ticket prices were a lot less, and just the whole world of, you know, how things there's no social media for promoting things. There's none of that, right? It's just get a little commercial spot on TV, and people would go to the theater and see the different films on the marquee and check something out. So for it to be a film that cost $7,200 that grossed $2.6 million was a huge success, and it actually inspired a lot of film school students and filmmakers to like get into this whole world, right? And like I said, it was a big influence on me. I was lucky enough to work on a couple commercials for the production company that Robert Rodriguez and Tarantino were part of, called A Band Apart. I worked on some commercials for them, was around Robert Rodriguez a little bit, got to be a camera assistant on an episode of ER that Quentin Tarantino directed, and then I also got to work with the cinematographer on several projects that shot Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs for Quentin Tarantino. His name was Andrzej Sakula, as a Polish cinematographer. So again, I was kind of around in this world when all this stuff was going on. It's a Mexican trilogy or mariachi trilogy. That's what this whole El Mariachi is part of, okay? So Robert Rodriguez made 3 films that were kind of connected, all kind of in the spirit of, I guess you would say, maybe the spaghetti western, right? There was the Dollar trilogy that we talked about in the spaghetti western, and we watched the first film of that, which was A Fistful of Dollars. El Mariachi is the first film of this trilogy, again, the Mexico trilogy or mariachi trilogy. Desperados, the second film. And then Once Upon a Time in Mexico was the third film in that trilogy. So if you're interested in this film, the production value goes way up in the next 2. Again, this one was made for $7,200. So it's just pretty crazy that he was able to do this with so little money. It's actually in the Library of Congress, this film, because of its cultural, historical, and aesthetically significant kind of attributes. The fact, again, that it was a Spanish language film made by an American filmmaker for such low amounts of money, and the fact that it got picked up and got distributed and was a success is why it makes it so significant to cinema history. Robert Rodriguez was the director, the DP, which is director of photography or cinematographer, so he filmed it, and he was also the editor. So he played all the major roles. There really wasn't a crew on this movie. It was just a guy who had an idea, and he went to make his movie. Which I think is very cool. And again, that's what inspired a lot of filmmakers at the time. It has a Guinness Book of World Record. It is the lowest budget film to ever make over $1 million. So that is a record that he has. And again, it's because of this. These are the reasons why I thought it would be a great film to check out, just to kind of see what people can do when they just have a story and they want to tell their story. So the narrative, again, we talked about it. It follows. It's a neo-Western, so it follows along some of the traditional Western tropes that you would see. It's got the classic kind of hero and antagonist, good guy, bad guy scenario that you saw in classic Westerns, right? The one thing that is kind of interesting here, though, in the very original classic Westerns, the good guy always wore white, the bad guy always wore black, or some version of that. By the time we got to the spaghetti Western, they were doing something a little bit different than that, and they were using the anti-hero. But in this film, the bad guy, the antagonist, wears white, and the good person, the good guy, the hero, wears black. So they just reverse the colors. And that's one of the things that you'll see in this kind of neo-Western kind of stuff, right? There's definitely a love interest in the film that plays a significant role, which is traditional in classic Westerns. And also, again, the thing that makes it a neo-Western is that it's set in a modern urban setting. So it's set in a small little kind of border town, and that's where we see most of this film take place. There's no big underlying message in this film, okay? There really just isn't... it doesn't have the kind of themes that people are exploring. It's not a very deep film. It's an action film that's meant to be fun and just go along for the ride and enjoy this little story that they put together, where it's about this mariachi who gets mixed up in this little drug gang war because he gets misidentified. They think he's somebody else, and he gets mixed up in this world, and he really wasn't trying to be there. There is a little bit of a character arc, but it's actually a reverse character arc than what you would traditionally look at, right? So again, this goes to the whole idea of it being a neo-Western. Typically, somebody starts off one way in their personality and their thoughts and their thinking and the way they are as a personality, and when they change or grow over the course of the movie, it's usually for the better, right? And in this particular film, it is in reverse. He is a naive, kind of young mariachi who wants to just play his music and find the love of his life and just and live a happy life, right? And by the end of the film, he's turned into like a cold-blooded killer because of the events that have happened to him. So his character arc is actually a reverse character arc, which kind of plays into that whole neo-Western kind of idea, okay? It definitely has a tragic ending, but it's full of action with moments of comedy. So you'll see this stuff play out, and the comedy is pretty interesting. It's pretty funny that they stick these little pieces of comedic stuff in there that actually resonate. I found myself laughing when I went back and watched this film. It was kind of fun to look at it again. The cinematography of this film, okay, it's shot on 16 millimeter, which is a smaller format of film than what was traditionally used. Most of the films that you guys are watching were shot on 35 millimeter, so it's twice as big, or even 65 millimeter. So that's why this stuff tends to look this way. This film's going to look a little grittier, a little grainier, even more so than the spaghetti western, and that's because, again, it's shot on a very small, kind of not very high-tech 16 millimeter camera with some older lenses. There really was no crew. It was just him. If you look at the credits at the end, it's just him and a couple people that are like refilling all these roles and stuff like that. There's no slate. So the slate is the little board that you see at the beginning of a shot, and they like clap down on the sticks and it says all this information on it. That is essential usually to the editing process, and so that the editors can identify what shot they're looking at. They didn't do that in this film. They didn't have one. They couldn't afford one. So the actors were using like their fingers to say what shot they were in and where it belonged in the film. There was no dolly. So the dolly and the crane, we talked a little bit about that in the last couple modules, where that kind of moves the camera along, right? They didn't have money for that. So they used a wheelchair and pushed Robert Rodriguez around in a wheelchair to get some of the moving shots, right? And so back then, I guarantee you, I had a wheelchair, and a lot of my shots I was doing in my low-budget films, we were doing them with wheelchairs because everybody was trying to get their hands on a wheelchair because that's what this film used, and everybody wanted to make a movie for no money, right? So they were using handheld or they had a bad tripod, because you'll see some of the camera moves are kind of and that's because the tripod just isn't very good. It's not really that they didn't know what they were doing. It's just they had very low budget equipment. And then you see handheld stuff in a lot of the movie, so that's why the camera work is a little bit rough. Minimal lighting, but they still managed to make it look pretty good. So by minimal lighting, I mean that they had two lights that were like 200 watt desk lamps lights, which is nothing when you're working on movies. And so that's all the lighting they had, and so they had to use a lot of available light, natural light coming in through windows and things like that. So again, almost in the style or the approach that they would use in some of the stuff in like the French New Wave, right? So in Breathless, we watched them hang around in an apartment, and that was all natural lighting, and so that was an approach that he had to use basically out of necessity, right? He had no money. Other things, squib. So what a squib is what you used to use, and they still may use this stuff today. They probably do. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's just more advanced. A squib is a blood hit, right? So when someone gets shot and you see the blood like coming out of them, it's called a squib, right? And typically, this is like a special effects mini pyrotechnics thing. It's like a little blood pack that they usually put on some kind of wood or metal kind of plate, and they kind of tape it to your chest kind of thing. And then there's a little charge that gets sent to it, which is what makes it explode and blow up, right? It's a little teeny explosion that sets it off, right? They didn't have that kind of technology, right? So when you look at the squib work in this movie, they do a lot of cool stuff. There's a lot of blood effects kind of things. And basically what they were using condoms filled with fake blood, and then they were kind of sticking it, and I don't know what kind of a charge they were using. And you'll see in some of the shots, you can see kind of the cardboard or whatever they were putting the little squib on. You'll see it like under their shirt and stuff, so you could look for that. Bloopers, they kept bloopers in the movie. Like there's a few bloopers they kept because they just didn't have the money to shoot the take again. Right, there's a shot where you're gonna watch the mariachi guy walking down the street, and he's looking at something, and he's carrying a machine gun kind of thing, and he hits it on a pole that he walks by, and it's just like, what was that about? And they kept it in the movie, like they should. It was an accident. It wasn't on purpose. At the very end of the film, you're gonna see there'll be a woman who's been killed, and she's laying on the ground, and you're going to see her move or flinch because they couldn't shoot it again. There's a few of those. There's a few different things. And so if you see something in the film that you're like, wait, what was that? It probably was a blooper, an accident, and they kept it because they didn't have the money to shoot it again. Undercranking. So we saw this in Nosferatu way back in the 20s, right? Where they slowed down how fast they were running the camera so that the film would speed up when we saw it. And you're going to see some undercranking in this film where they use some effect work where they want everything to move really quick. And you're going to see it play out, and it plays pretty well. Like, they do a good job of it in this particular movie. So look for that in the cinematography. Overall, again, it's pretty rough, low-budget filmmaking, but again, still very impressive for how much money they were working with. Next to nothing. The acting performances. Most of these actors are non-professional actors. They're just people that they know, people that they ran into, people that they wanted to use their location, so they gave them a role in the movie. The only professional actor who really went on and did any kind of professional work was the guy who plays the mariachi in the film. Okay, everybody else really didn't do much at all professionally. The extras, you'll even look in the background of the shots if you pay attention. People are just like watching, like they're not regular extras. They're just people who were there and they needed to shoot, and so you'll see people in the background like watching what they're doing, kind of thing. The El Mariachi is got that dark character arc, which we talked a little bit about before. So look for that, right? See how it's actually in reverse, right? He starts off very innocent and naive and just has this great outlook, and then how his outlook on things has changed by the time we get to the end of the film. So that would be part of the whole neo-Western kind of idea. It's not a happy ending. It's a tragic story, and how it plays out, you'll see that reverse arc. So check that out. Editing. So big thing here, it's got some interesting stuff, right? This thing was edited by Robert Rodriguez. Again, he was the director, the cinematographer, and the editor. What they do is they would shoot it on film, and big movies, they shoot it on film back then, not today. They would shoot on film, and then somebody would actually edit it on film. Like they would cut the film, splice it together, put it, and that's a really painstaking process, and it's expensive. But what you could do back then, and this was just getting started in the early 90s, they took the film, did something called a telecine transfer. Now, telecine transfer is they take the film and lay it down on some kind of videotape format, or they can nowadays change it to a digital format, right? And so back then they were putting it on a videotape format, probably digital DV tape is what it was probably called, and then they would edit it on a video machine, and that's how they made the movie, right? It was finished on video, not even digital, like actual videotape is how it would edit it on what's called a reel-to-reel machine. So you would have like a VCR deck basically, or some kind of tape deck, and another tape deck, and you would kind of sync up where you wanted a shot to start and where you wanted a shot to end, and then they would, like, the one machine would lay it down and record it onto this other machine. That was kind of the process. But you had to start with a telecine transfer, transferring it from film to video. It was a non-linear. They might have done a little bit of non-linear editing in this particular movie. I was trying to figure out whether it was completely that tape to tape, or if they used any kind of digital. This is very, very early on in video editing. Like nowadays, people just walk around with their laptops and you can edit a movie right on your laptop. Back then was not the case, right? This is when I was early film school, early filmmaking. You would have this big disc, and on that big disc, you could carry about 10 minutes, 15 minutes of footage at a very low resolution. Like, it was really bad. And so editing digitally and at this time was really hard if you were trying to do a big movie. So it was probably a combination of both, using this non-linear editing, which is digital editing basically, and then using this tape-to-tape process to finish the film. Sound design. The sound was recorded on like a little tape deck recorder. So it's actual audio tape on a reel-to-reel kind of thing, and you just hit the record button, and that's the kind of way they were doing the audio. So they weren't shooting what's called sync audio. So sync audio is when you have the camera, and then you have the audio recording device, and then there's a person holding a microphone out over the shot, and then when they hit that slate, the little sticks that they hit. In fact, I don't used to have one. I don't have one on me in here right now. Those sticks, what they do is they look for the image of the sticks hitting, and then on the audio they go find the sound of the sticks hitting, the little clap sound, and then what they do is they line those up, right? They take the video of it and they take the audio of it and then they line it up, and so when the thing comes down, the noise gets made, and then the audio will be in sync. So now the words will match when their mouth moves, kind of thing, right? Well, in this film, they didn't do it that way because, again, they didn't have money. So they were just recording this audio, which it's basically called a scratch track nowadays. And that's what they were using to do the audio in the film. They really just tried to manually sync it up themselves without any kind of sync marks. They could have clapped their hands, I guess, if they were thinking, but that's not what they did. The mariachi song, there's one song that's performed by the mariachi in a bar, and they found a local artist, and just recorded him with a little hand mic, and then they dubbed that in over the mariachi singing the song, so that he sounds a little better. He probably wasn't as good a singer as they needed, and so they did it. So dubbing is just putting in this audio afterwards when it was completely not attached to the original audio at all, right? It's completely different things. That's what dubbing is, and we've seen some films where they use some dubbing. Cinematic terms for this particular lecture: neo-Western, right? So that's the idea of it's follows some of the Western traditions, right? The Western tropes that you would see in Western films, classic Western films, but it's set in this urban setting, and it's got a little bit darker tone story, right? An independent film. So any film that is not associated with a major studio is considered indie. Nowadays, the term is used a lot less, indie filmmaking, but there's a lot of filmmaking that's indie filmmaking these days, where you can distribute it yourself on YouTube or Vimeo or all kinds of other streaming services or whatever, right? And there's actually studios that are considered more indie studios in general. Back then, Miramax was a studio that came up as a very small kind of independent studio, which was not attached to the major Hollywood players, but it actually became a major studio. Nowadays, there's a whole bunch of them. There's a horror one called Blumhouse or Bloomhouse or something. That's kind of indie. There's A24, which is another one. There's a few of them that are kind of smaller market kind of studio system, kind of, or studios that produce smaller films. Telecine, so that is transferring from film to a videotape or digital format, so you don't have to edit on film. And then squib. A squib is that, again, that blood pack that you see in films when someone gets shot and you see the blood kind of explode out of them. That's called a squib. So those are the terms for this week. It's a fun little movie. Again, don't expect too much visually. It was made for $7,000 at a time when shooting on film, like even a super small movie back then, was considered maybe $100,000, right? $100,000 film back then was like, that's super low budget. Man, we have no money. $7,000, that's like, doesn't even cover food, even on a small movie. So don't expect much that way, but it's a pretty fun movie. I think it's pretty influential, and the fact that he went out and made his movie with such little money and just solved the problems that needed to be solved to get his shots on camera is very impressive. So hopefully you enjoyed as much as I do. Take care. If you got any issues, reach out.